Hi YouTube, Charlie Black 20 back once again with another military battle review of the grass fight and the Battle of Bexar, both of which took place in 1835. Now, basically, the Texas Army under command of Edward Burleson has laid siege to the town of San Antonio de Bejar and the Spanish mission of the Alamo, which is being used as a fort by General Perfecto de Cos, Martin Perfecto de Cos, who is the brother-in-law of dictator Antonio Lopez de Santana and the military governor of Texas. Cos has a total of 800 men under his command, and he sends out a group of 50 to 100 Mexican soldiers with a pack of mule trains outside 5 miles outside the city of Bejar after several weeks of siege. And Burleson learns of this and orders Jim Bowie, the famous knife fighter and commander at the Battle of Concepcion, to take 30 to 40 mounted volunteers and a company of about 100 infantry to attack the train and drive them back to the city. Now, the entire army starts hearing rumors that within the pack train is a bunch of silver. So Burleson barely manages to keep the entire army from going to attack by sending another company of infantry to support Bowie. So Bowie and his men encounter the train and launch their attack. Very quickly, they scare off a lot of the mules, and there's pandemonium for a moment. And then the Mexican soldiers, again about 50 to 100, take cover in this dry creek bed and begin exchanging fire with the Texas infantry and mounted men who've now gotten off their horses, who also take cover in another dry riverbed and begin exchanging shots with each other. The Mexicans do try to charge and get their bayonets into the Texans, but they are repulsed before they can get there. And Cos, hearing the gunfire, sends another 50 infantry along with a cannon to help the Mexican soldiers escape back to the town. And this is exactly what happens. Another company of Texas infantry has arrived, but they almost get caught in a crossfire by both Mexican forces, so they are forced to take cover very, very fast. And the Mexicans withdraw back to the city without their pack train. And when Bowie and his men open up the packs, instead of finding the silver they were hoping for, all they find is grass and other fodder to feed the horses of the Mexican army. So they are discouraged by the fact there's no silver, but they do take heart to the idea that, oh, Cos is sending men out to get food for his horses. They must be starving in there if they're doing this, when they know they're vulnerable to attack. And so the grass fight costs Cos 3 killed and 7 to 14 wounded. And for the Texans, it cost them 4 wounded and 1 man deserted. So that happened on November 26th, 1835. And finally, 6 weeks into the siege, Edward Burleson, again the commander of the Texas Army, makes a decision that the army needs to go into winter quarters. It's December, it's winter time, it's going to be cold, the men don't really have any discipline. They've gotten a few units of these volunteers who are similar to regular soldiers. They're called the New Orleans Grays, and they've come mainly from America, but they've formed units under Texas leadership, and they act like real soldiers. They actually have uniforms, they've got adequate weapons and supplies for themselves. But the majority of the Texas Army, about 600 men at this point, is all, as I said, the Texas Army, about 600 strong, is all volunteers for the most part. Again, backed up by these New Orleans Grays, but they're a minority. And the Texas Army is ill-disciplined. They are not a regular army. They are volunteers who elect their own officers and choose when and where they'll fight and how long they'll stay in camp. So, not very disciplined. Brave, for the most part, but not an army in the traditional sense. So Burleson decides to have a council of war and has his officers vote on whether they'll go into winter quarters, which they actually vote against. They actually wish to attack the city. And one officer in particular is vehement about not going into winter quarters. His name is Benjamin Milham, who made his name at the Battle of Goliad. And he immediately steps outside of Burleson's tent and asks for volunteers to join him in an attack. And about 300 men step forward to join him. So Edward Burleson manages to keep the rest of the men, again another 300 men, from leaving camp by persuading them that if help is needed or if the camp is attacked, they should be there to defend it. And also, what would happen if they left and their friends succeeded where they were afraid? So, the next morning, December 5th, Milham and Frank Johnson lead 2 columns of those 300 men to attack the city of Bejar. And it is a complete surprise to the Mexican soldiers. They were not expecting this. And for the next 5 days, you got fierce hand-to-hand combat, house-to-house fighting, snipers, cannon, and the Texans basically take almost the entire town. There's one section of it still held by a battalion of Mexican soldiers who are veterans, but for the most part, the entire town has fallen to the Texas soldiers. Coase decides to withdraw the majority of his troops back to the Alamo to protect them, where even though they do have these stone walls to protect them, the Texans start digging in. They start digging trenches, building barricades throughout the towns, and they snipe at any Mexican soldier they see on the walls. And because they usually carry rifles rather than muskets, the Mexican soldiers can't afford to put their head up, otherwise they're likely to get several bullets to the head. So, on December 7th, halfway through the fight, Benjamin Milham is killed by a sniper. So, command of the attack goes to Frank Johnson. And Coase is stuck. He is hoping for supplies and reinforcements. He doesn't get any supplies whatsoever. He does get a contingent of reinforcements, about 400 men, but when they arrive during the fight, they're useless because all they're doing is eating up the rest of his very, very short amount of supplies. And these are the dregs of what they could scrape up south of the Rio Grande. And they've marched this whole time. They are not experienced men. These are raw recruits. Some of them are just plain out criminals. And so Coase is debating whether to attack the Texans himself, to counterattack both the town and the Texas camp. Now, I am not entirely sure if he did make an attack on the camp, because what happens is that when a few companies of his cavalry hear about this idea, they actually leave. They desert under the guise that they were going on a scouting mission. But about 200 Mexican cavalry basically desert Coase in the moment. And the cavalry was the most deadly weapon of the Mexican army to the Texans. So Coase can't really go on the offensive anymore, and he's out of supplies, so he opens up negotiations with the Texas forces to surrender his garrison of about 800 men at this point. And Burleson and Johnson receive this. They call for an immediate ceasefire. Over the next few days, they negotiate with Coase surrender terms. What they come up with for Coase's surrender is that his men will be able to march out of San Antonio. So, some can stay if they have ties to the region directly, like family or business. But Coase and his soldiers must march out of Texas with a pledge never to return to fight in the Texas Revolution. And they're allowed to keep most of their weapons, their muskets and pistols and swords, along with one cannon, one 4-pound cannon, for defense against any Native American attacks by Comanches, Apaches, things like that, who are not very kind towards the Mexican government, obviously. But Coase has to leave the rest of his supplies, especially all the cannons he had, which will later bring about a change during the Battle of the Alamo. But Coase, after several days, has to march out of San Antonio, march across the interior of Texas, and return to Mexico. And that's exactly what he does. But we learn later that he breaks his pledge. And when Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna finds him, his brother-in-law, he immediately orders him and his men to turn around and rejoin the fight. But this is the largest victory up until San Jacinto for the entire Texas Revolution. This was their biggest win so far. They have driven almost every single Mexican soldier out of Texas, if not every single one. Every organized body of Mexican soldiers is now gone. They are south of the Rio Grande. And this gives the Texans a breath of relief. They think that nothing's going to happen again until after spring, which would be around April, May. They don't realize that Santa Anna had already started marching with a new army, a veteran army with conscripts as well, but a new army ready to fight across the interior of Mexico and Texas in a march that would cost Santa Anna 500 soldiers to cold, sickness, starvation. But he will get to Texas, the city of San Antonio, by February of 1836, when nobody was expecting him to come back that fast. So that at the siege of Bejar, it cost the Mexican soldiers 150 killed, wounded, and missing, plus 200 deserted and 800 surrendered and returned to Mexico temporarily. For the Texans, it only cost them 38 killed, wounded, and missing. So a big disparity there. And again, I think it came down to equipment and to a certain extent fighting spirit. Like the Mexican soldiers, a lot of them did not want to be there. They were not the creme de la creme of the Mexican army. The majority of those were further inland in Mexico. So Texas was a frontier place. It was not considered the greatest place to go for most Mexican citizens. And to go there and fight a war against a bunch of rebels and pirates who, by your account, were taking over a place that seemed insignificant. But again, this is for the soldiers themselves rather than the people of Mexico. And the Texas soldiers, the Texan volunteers, they wanted a fight. They wanted to get in there and fight. And they truly did believe they were fighting to liberate people from a tyrannical government by upholding the Constitution of 1824. That was what they believed they would be doing. Not to mention they had a lot at stake for themselves because they had a lot of families they were taking care of. There were other considerations on their minds. Plus, they did not want to look bad in front of their comrades by not fighting. So a lot of them stayed because of that. And that's a big motivator, not to look weak or cowardly in front of your friends and other comrades. Even if you don't like each other, you can't look like a coward. And so, the Siege of Bejar was the last victory for the Texans until the Battle of San Jacinto. And because of this, a lot of Texas volunteers and a lot of American volunteers went home. So the army dwindled to a great degree and basically splintered into several groups. One under Frank Johnson, who along with another man, James Grant, decided to make a raid on the city of Matamoros across the Rio Grande and to get supplies and money for the Texas cause. At the same time, another contingent, a much larger contingent that would number almost over 400 men under James Fannin, was to be sent to Matamoros to join them, but he ends up taking over La Bahia and the fortress of Goliad, where he basically rebuilds the place and makes it defensible, but also sends out scouting parties and learning everything he can, as well as gathering up any supplies he can in the countryside. But then things go awry for the Texas revolutionaries. That will be in the next video, where I will cover 2 more battles, the Battle of Anglo-Dice and the Battle of San Patricio. So, thank you very much for tuning in, and take care, everybody.